Flight Captain Sula Morgan, unknown system. Sula watched the convoy slowly make its way through the asteroid belt, and briefly wondered if she had ever looked this sloppy. She had the squadron's channel open and could hear them bickering even now. Rosa and Parsky were out front arguing about who was taking point, drawing them further from the lead freighter. Nina and Tina were at the back talking about the rest of the squadron not paying attention to their surroundings. Most of the others were somewhere in the middle arguing about who was element lead, where they should be positioned, and all manner of other things. She was going to have to work hard to get them into better habits right away, but this was just about getting a sense of their abilities. From her position, she could easily see the layout of the convoy and the fighters around them. Besides their bickering, they weren't arranged in any sort of good cover position, and the freighters were woefully underprotected. Of course, right now the freighters didn't need to be protected. It was more about the layout of the fighters themselves, and they were all belly down to her. Not one of them had thought to change their plane orientation. At least Gareth had diverted his sensor power to focus the range beneath him, but even then he had it swept forward. Not to mention whenever in an asteroid field that the rocks, though scattered, could still provide decent shielding from sensor readings. Well, there was no point in waiting to see if they worked things out further down the line. She triggered the attack and watched as fighters detached from the asteroids on either side of the convoy and began to sweep in. The fighters were stags. They were old even at the beginning of the war while her squadron was in Corsairs. Theoretically, 12 stags against 12 Corsairs should be an easy matchup, but she didn't have any faith in her kids, her trainees. Don't think of them as children. You're expecting them to kill, she reminded herself. Either way, she watched them split up and scatter as the stags closed in. Half raced out to meet them, while the other half stayed near the convoy. Sula groaned and shook her head as she watched them devolve into single fighters without pairs. They didn't even attempt to get into elements, and half were calling for the other half to be their subordinate wing. Except Gareth, he didn't even talk, he just flew at the stags without telling the others his plan, whatever it was. Tina and Nina stayed together. At least 2 of her 12 had some idea of what to do, but they kept near the rear of the convoy, protecting it from no one. They seemed hesitant to join the others. Well, Sula would bring the fight to them then. Angling her phoenix towards them, she punched her engines and felt the straps drag her back into the seat. They hadn't spotted her yet, it seemed, or they were focused on the stags now engaging the others. Sula queued up 2 Sparrow missiles set to target of opportunity as she approached, leaving her gun quiet. Just before she reached the 2 Corsairs still belly facing her, she launched them and twisted her phoenix to slip between the 2 fighters just before the missiles hit and detonated with them. 2 pilots down. Arcing up over the convoy, she swept down at an angle towards the middle. She could hear them in her ear, some angry, some fearful, all of them confused. Except Gareth, that kid, still hadn't said a word. The 4 still near the freighter split then, 2 heading up towards her, 2 splitting away to try and join the others fighting the stags. Hito and Gabriella were heading up towards her, both firing their cannons wildly before bothering to get a solid firing line. Sula just sighed and spun her phoenix, feeling the force tilt her to the side as she launched her 2 hydras. With the cannons firing wildly, they likely didn't see the missiles, and obviously weren't paying attention to their computers as the multiple warheads detonated in their faces, shredding the Corsairs. Sula was already diving down harder to get in behind Rebecca. The Corsair bucked and twisted, but Sula's phoenix could fly circles around the older fighter if need be. She locked onto the fighter and launched a Sparrow, but tilted up and fired off her guns just after. Her 320mm Gatling guns spewing out bullets into the void, lacking any tracer rounds, and the high-pitched whir she could hear wouldn't carry across the void. Just like she thought, the pilot launched chaff and pulled up to avoid the missile, only to slam into the hail of bullets and get torn apart. She looked over at her console as she sighed, checking to see how many were left. Then she frowned as she saw both Rosa and Parsky were already dead. 7 dead already compared with just 4 stags. She growled a little and gripped her stick harder as she twisted her phoenix up to climb above the general plane of the combat. Just as she did, her computer flashed a missile warning at her. Finally, she stopped her climb and instead popped chaff as she then dove back down, arcing away from the cloud of chaff behind her as the missiles detonated harmlessly. Kim was firing at her while Sula dove down, but she had little trouble turning her phoenix out the stream of cannon fire, as Kim had only been firing straight along Sula's path. She'd need to remind them to sway a bit to create a fan of cannon fire that was harder to dodge. But for now, she fired off 2 more sparrows and watched Kim try to turn and run. But she wasn't nearly fast enough to avoid the 2 missiles that came in. Even as she deployed chaff, they detonated too close to her Corsair, sending it spinning into the side of one of the freighters. 8 dead now. Just as she thought about that, her console flashed red over Fritz and Cortez. Sula sighed as she looked to see who was left. Gareth and Pack, plus 6 of the stags. 6? She shook her head once more and looked at the radar display in the corner of her vision for any kind of sighting on the others. Pack was chasing a stag, but another stag was chasing her. Sula veered away from the convoy to head out towards the fighter chain happening further out in the asteroids. With her speed, she had little trouble closing in on the string, and as she watched, Pack finally got a lock on the stag, launching her 2 sparrows to finish it off. As Sula closed in, however, the stag chasing Pack split off, giving her a clear line at the Corsair. Sula began to open up with her guns when she saw a blip on the radar in the corner of her vision. Gareth was above her, and she saw the flash of a missile just above her as she closed in on Pack, but she didn't have a missile lock on her. She quickly dove down away from Pack just as the missiles slammed into her, detonating the Corsair. Sula saw warning lights as debris from the exploded fighter collided with her Phoenix, and Gareth was already diving towards her. Reaching out, she quickly diverted power to engines and away from everything but her guns. She knew Gareth would be right behind her and didn't need radar for that. She saw the gold arc of tracers pass her just as she juked down, and then left and started to bank hard right immediately after. She couldn't see any more tracers now, but knew Gareth would be right behind her, trying to turn in on her and get a shot. But the Phoenix was far more agile than the Corsair, and she just kept turning, ignoring the feel of the straps tugging her into the seat as she turned tighter and tighter, just before reaching out and venting oxygen to spin her fighter around. Gareth's Corsair hung right before her. Clearly he didn't know that trick as she yanked on the trigger and her 320mm Gatling guns opened up, tearing the Corsair to pieces after a few seconds. Sula then sighed and looked over at her console. They were all dead and just 7 stags with them. The only damage the freighters had taken was Kim's fighter slamming into one. Shaking her head, she popped off her seat straps, then reaching up she popped the lock on the cockpit and pushed on it to make the automated system open faster. As the cockpit opened, the void and battle was replaced with bright lights, and she hopped out of the simulator. She stood in her office looking out over the dozen simulators in the room beyond, the one-way glass shielding her from the view of all her dead trainees. They were getting out of their own simulators now, arguing and bickering immediately. Sula just shook her head, and then opened the door, stepping out onto balcony overlooking the training room. "Hey! Hey!" she had to call out to get their attention. The kids stopped their fighting to look at her. Only half of them saluted. Sula crossed her arms then and stared at the others who had yet to salute until one by one they lifted a hand to their head. Most of the ground forces and Navy grunts did the fist to their heart, but the pilots still did the old-fashioned style. She noticed Gareth was the last to begrudgingly salute her. "At ease," Sula finally said, and they dropped their hands, some quicker than others. "Someday soon I hope to not need to enforce the rules about saluting an officer who enters the room, but that will require better behavior on all of your parts." She glanced around the room and uncrossed her arms, leaning forward to set her palms on the railing of the balcony. "But today is not that day. You were incredibly sloppy in there, and it's not like this was the first run of the day." "You didn't assign—" Hito started, but Sula chopped a hand through the air. "Shut the fuck up! I didn't give you permission to talk!" The young man— Fuck, the teenager shut up after she snapped at him. "I didn't assign elements or leads." "That's correct. One of the things this simulation was about was seeing how you all reacted to being put on even footing with one another. The answer very clearly is not fucking well. Tina and Nina were the only 2 who actually grouped up. But then they didn't move to help anyone. They just hung back, ignored their radar, and died almost immediately. On my own, I was able to kill most of you. Without taking any direct damage from any of you," she hissed out, upset with their performance. "I hit you, and I got 3 kills, Gareth then protested before Sula pointed at him. "You didn't hit me! You killed a fucking friendly in the attempts of catching me in the blast unaware since you locked onto her and not me. What the fuck were you thinking? If you ever dare pull a dumbass stunt like that again, you're out. I don't care how bad we might need pilots. There is absolutely no place in this fleet for a glory hog jackass who thinks it's okay to kill friendlies in order to kill the enemy. Sula took a deep breath then, which brings up another point. You're all too focused on taking charge. You've got movies in your head, or worse yet, games, and think it's okay to die so long as you have a positive KD ratio. What I'm training you for isn't a game. It's not a simulation. One day you'll be out in the void in a real battle and death is final. I'm not trying to train you how to get the most kills. I want to train you all how to fucking survive! Speaking of all of you had 2 sparrows to use at the beginning of the simulation, what the fuck were you all waiting for? 2 sparrows each against 12 stags. You could all fire twice and get most of them. Why didn't you? There was silence as no one wanted to answer or even look up at her right now, so she pointed. Gabriella, you just fired your cannons at me. No missiles. Why? I was saving them. Sula blinked and waved at that. For what? Was there anything in the intel saying that bigger targets were coming? Mention of bombers or anything? She looked around for a moment and no one added anything. You have missiles to use them. Aren't they expensive, Tina? One of the twins asked as Sula just scoffed. What do you think is more expensive? A missile or a fighter and its pilot? They got quiet again. Did any of you even think about the mission brief? Did you pay any attention at all? I'll answer that for you. No. It was a convoy run in pirate territory. You need to think about your opponent. Pirates don't have bombers! Aren't we supposed to be the... Parsky started to say, before Sula cut him off. Shut the fuck up. This is about training. I don't want some smart-ass comment about us being the pirates. Which brings me to my next point. Why did you and Rosa kill each other? Both of them started at the same time, each blaming the other, saying they got in the other's way of a shot. They collided and then hit an asteroid. Sula began waving her hands to get them to stop. Shut up. This is what I'm talking about. You're all obsessed with glory. This isn't about kills. It's about survival. If someone tells you they have a shot on a target, drop back and cover them. But you didn't assign... Hito started yet again, but Sula glared at him and he stopped talking. That's part of the point. You all need to learn when to take lead and when to drop back. Remember how this is a simulation about protecting a convoy from pirates? Pirates don't want the freighters to explode. That's their meal ticket. You need to think about that. Why? Because if you stay in close to the freighters, they can help provide covering fire. And this isn't a 2D space. I came from below and all of you missed me until it was too late. If you're all arranged the same, then that means you've got a giant fucking blind spot. We're not in gravity. Climbing and diving are just about going towards or away from wherever the plane of the battle is currently. And that changes. Rotate your craft so your sensors can provide a bubble. None of you are anywhere close to being ready for atmospheric flights, so don't even think about that. There's no up or down. Not really. It's just your orientation to a particular axis. Sula took another deep breath after that spiel and then sighed. 50 push-ups and 20 laps, then another simulation. There was groaning, and then she saw Gareth mutter and cross his arms. As the others began to drop down to do their push-ups, he wasn't. Gareth, may I remind you that I am your commanding officer. This isn't a boarding party. We are not rabble. This is a fighter squadron, and as such we conduct ourselves as a military organization. I have the authority to dish out any punishment I see fit, up to and including immediate execution for failure to obey a direct command. I don't really want to kill you for not doing your fucking push-ups, but do not forget that I have been given direct and complete control over your very life. Now drop and give me 100 followed by 30 laps. The trainee glared at her, mouth set, and she slowly let her hand fall to the gun on her hip before he finally dropped down and started to do push-ups. She knew some of them would be stubborn, but Lucifer was he as pig-headed a man as she had ever met. She was going to need to beat some sense into him somehow. The problem was he was better than the others. He knew it, and she knew it. But he seemed to think that made it okay for him to be a lone wolf glory hound. She shook her head as she mixed her phrases like that. End result, if she didn't straighten him out, people would die because of his arrogance. Good people. Don't forget, if you all keep up this sort of behavior, I'll bring a drill sergeant in. And then I promise none of you will misbehave. She began to pace along the balcony after threatening them with a drill sergeant. She watched the recruits do their push-ups before some of the faster ones got up to start running around the room. This was a hell of a way to be made captain. She just hoped she could keep them alive long enough to relish being their leader. She walked back into her office then and closed the door. With the mirrored glass, they'd have no idea if she were watching them or not. But she'd check the recordings to make sure everyone did their laps. For now, she rubbed her eyes and then started a call to Fry. Fry here. Oh, Sula. I mean Captain Sula. How goes the training? Sula always felt slightly annoyed by how bright and cheerful the engineer was, though she tried to get past it. Why should she be upset someone else was happy? Terribly. It's going to be months before they're ready, but I get the feeling they'll be deployed long before I'm confident in them, and they'll just all die messy, pointless deaths. The woman on the screen blinked at that. Well, maybe you'll like to hear that we think we've got the stability issues on your fighter fixed. She smiled wide at that, but Sula reserved her judgment. They'd told her it had been fixed before, too. And the other zombies? Are they going to be operational by the end of the month? I'd like to see how they each handle so I can know which recruit to assign to which zombie. Sula smirked just a little as Fry frowned. Now I wish everyone would stop calling them that. It's worse than calling them junkers. We've all been working really hard on these, you know. Fighters need name designations, Fry. You said no to Junker and Frankenstein's monster is way too long. Sula crossed her arms and shrugged. Well, why not call them angels? Fry tried as she perked up a bit. Fry, aren't you a Satanist like most of the crew? Sula watched the woman frown and rub her chin. Oh, right. Well, what about calling them fallen angels then? She tried and Sula just shook her head slowly. No? Too long also? Well, just not zombies. That sounds unpleasant. Sula kept staring at her as the engineer began to squirm. Just come try out the fighter! Sula shrugged and glanced out the window as most of the recruits were doing laps now. Gareth was just getting up to start his own. Give me 10 minutes to get them started on the next simulator and then I'll head over. Okay. See you soon? Sula rolled her eyes as the engineer ended the call like that. She sounded like Sula was coming over to watch movies and talk about boys. Maybe that's what bothered Sula. The woman was at least 15 years her senior, but acted like they were high school friends. Sula shook her head and sat down then as she looked at the monitor, rewinding the footage from the testing room to make sure everyone did the correct number of push-ups. They had even Gareth. As she watched them now continue to run laps around the large room, she wondered if she really could keep them all alive. At least for a while. Tina and Nina were an obvious element, though she had yet to figure out which sister would make the better lead. Rosa and Parsky were going to be butting heads until they finally fucked. She pegged Rosa as lead for now, but she'd see how that shook out after they realized why they both got agitated by the other so easily. Kids, she shook her head a moment. Pac was one of her better pilots, but she had no confidence, and Gareth had too much. She might make Pac the lead, force her to deal with Gareth and make Gareth submit, teach him to be humble and her to be confident at the same time. Or he could totally run over her decisions and get them both killed. Sula cursed quietly. Had it been like this for her superiors when she was in the academy before the end of the war? Did they watch their students with a wary caution, knowing they'd be sending young pilots very quickly to their deaths? She leaned forward on her desk and rubbed her face with a hand. Between this and trying to get someone, anyone, to look for Jack, she had more than just a little craving to get completely shit-faced. But that wouldn't actually solve anything, and she couldn't afford to get careless. So she took a breath and thought about more of her students. Tio and Gabriella were too quick for their own good. She'd pair Hito with Fritz and Gabriella with Kim and hope that they worked to even each other out. Who did that leave? Rebecca and Cortez. Neither one really impressed her, but they weren't particularly flawed. She'd pair them up a few times and see how they performed. How long before they were all dead? Sula scowled as that thought came to her mind, and she got up trying to push the thought from her head as she brought up the simulation lists and began to scan them for something that would give her ample time to go test run the Junker, or Zombie, or whatever they were going to call Fry's abominations. That wasn't bad. Abomination. That might work. She focused on the simulation list again, and then nodded as she picked one out. The bombing of Nirla. It would test their endurance and give them varied environments. She'd have 2 hours minimum once the simulation began. Queuing up the program, she pressed a button to turn on the microphone in her office. Once you're done with your laps, take a 5-minute break and then get in your pods for the next run. I won't be telling you what it is, so pay attention to the fucking briefing, she stressed, and then turned the mic back off. She turned then and headed out the door, confident they'd obey her since she'd busted them several times before by checking the recordings. As she opened the door, though, she took a surprised step back, looking at an equally startled Jasmine Nishizawa, who had been about to knock. They both let out a nervous chuckle at the odd situation, and then Sula waved her in. Come on in, Colonel." "Please just call me Jasmine." The other pilot smiled and stepped into the office. She licked her lips as she looked around the fairly bare office and didn't say anything for a moment. Sula looked her over. Rather than a normal uniform, the other pilot was still in a regular flight suit. She didn't even have rank tabs on it. But she was wearing her Confederate cross around her neck with the Crimson Star cluster at the center, the highest award the now-defunct nation could bestow. Sula wondered why the woman was here. She knew of her, of course. Who didn't know the Ace of Aces? But they'd only rarely interacted, and never on a social level. Sula kept waiting, but the other woman just seemed to look around the room unsure of how to begin. So Sula tried. "So, Jasmine, what brings you to my humble office?" The pilot smiled then. "It looks just like my instructor's office back at the academy. 1,000,000 years ago, it feels like." Sula laughed and nodded at that. "Yeah, it felt so weird when I first came in here, to have it be my office when I was used to being out there." She nodded at the window looking over the training pods. "Oh, that's right," Jasmine said with a nod. "I forgot you were academy trained." "Didn't graduate, though." Sula shrugged and Jasmine nodded, looking sad for a moment. "Look, I just wanted to say that—" She got quiet again and frowned, but Sula felt like she just needed some time and didn't try to spur her on. "Thanks," she finally said, which made Sula blink and lean back, confused. "Thanks? For what?" She couldn't think of anything Jasmine had to thank her for. For taking this assignment. I'm sure you've heard by now that I said teaching was beneath someone of my skill. That any real pilot wouldn't waste their time with kids. Sula frowned at that. Actually, I hadn't heard that. The other pilot's eyes got wide then before she groaned and pressed her hands to her face. "Shit," came the muffled reply. "I'm sorry. I just thought— Fuck. This is why I didn't want the assignment, and I came here to say it wasn't true. Because it's not. I mean, I did say that. But only to try and seem—" She shrugged and pulled her hands from her face. "I don't know, stronger? Look." She reached out, setting a hand on Sula's shoulder. "I think that being an instructor is incredibly difficult, and only wanted our new pilots to be trained by the best. Because that's the only way to keep them alive. When I asked who else was on the list and I heard it was you, that's why I turned it down. Because you're stronger than me." Sula blinked at that, her mouth hanging open a little as her brain tried to come up with a good response. But it was having trouble processing what she'd just been told. "Stronger," was all she could finally mutter. "Yes, I've seen you." The determination, something I might have had. But now, do you know how many partners I've lost? How many friends? Good, very close friends? The older pilot's shoulders sagged then as her hand fell from Sula. The thought of training a bunch of new kids, it terrified me. I couldn't do it. She swallowed then, her eyes looking a bit more moist than Sula had ever seen. "So, thank you for taking this assignment, for being stronger than me. Her right hand moved up to slowly brush over the metal at her throat. "If you had been born earlier, I'm sure you'd have won your own Cross and Crimson Star cluster. You've got the skills and more determination than any other pilot still in the fleet. So if no one else tells you, I think you're a great pilot, one of the greatest. And you're stronger than me, and thanks." "Jasmine?" Sula started rather unsure of what to say, but the other pilot just leaned forward, hugging her tight. Sula slowly and uneasily began to hug her back before Jasmine suddenly pulled away. "Ha, I look forward to seeing you get back out there with your new fighter Void Fox. It's not the same without you to try and compete with." Then she turned and marched out of the office, not waiting for Sula to reply. As the door closed behind her, Sula stood alone in her office, blinking. What just happened? She finally wondered aloud, unsure if that had really just happened. Jasmine Nishizawa had been an idol to her, an unstoppable fighter pilot who had shown the Congos that the Confederacy would never go quietly. She had never expected her to approach her like this. She looked out the window into the training room once more, eyes drifting over her recruits as she took a slow, deep breath and then headed out the door. She still had an abomination to test. She looked either way down the hall when she stepped outside but saw no sign of the Ace of Aces. Had that conversation even really happened? It seemed like something out of a dream to her. Briefly, she pinched her arm and then rubbed the flesh, as it certainly felt real. Slowly shaking her head, she began to walk down towards the nearby elevator. The training room was just above the rear hangar on the Retribution, so she wasn't far from Fry and her workshop. She did notice one of the elevators at the bank was moving up levels, but she took another one down to the hangar. As she walked out, she could see the various fighters spread out across the deck, and Fry's work crews tending to them. She walked towards the front of the hangar to her own craft. They'd already painted it black and purple. It was now the Void Fox. She wasn't really sure that fighter was a Void Fox, though. It was without a doubt the fastest fighter she'd ever been in, but that gun? No. That monster it was built around was no fighter weapon. She still wasn't sure how effective an anti-armor cannon was going to be against other fighters. "Hey there, darlin'. Did Jasmine find you?" Sula supposed that she hadn't just imagined her meeting then as Fry approached and asked her that. She did. Sula crossed her arms, unsure what to say about their little meeting, but Fry had a different idea in her head and waved as she talked. "Oh, don't go minding whatever she said. I know she can act like a real bitch sometimes, but she's got heart. Never mind that rubbish she said about the skill of teachers and all that. She just wanted an excuse to not do the hard work." Sula decided not to tell the engineer that the Ace of Aces had most certainly not acted bitchy with her. Instead, she nodded at the fighter before them. "So you said the abomination is ready?" She couldn't help but smirk a bit as Fry groaned. "Oh, now you just keep coming up with names to hurt ma feelings," the engineer protested while Sula's smirk got a bit bigger. "But, yes, it is ready, and we're fairly confident that this time the stabilizers will hold. You just have to not be moving." "Not be moving?" Sula asked then. "Fry, this is a fighter. If I sit still in combat, I die." "Well, just go really slow then." "Just for now. We're still tweaking it." Sula sighed and then shrugged. "Fuck it. I'm here, aren't I?" She started to climb up into her fighter as the engineer grinned. "That's the spirit." As Sula climbed into the cockpit, the crew pulled the ladder away and began going through a final pre-launch check, which gave her time to set up her helmet and open a channel to the tower. "Tower, this is Void Fox requesting permission to launch for a test flight." "Void Fox, this is Tower, please hold." She waited about 10 seconds before they came back on. "You're all green for test flight, Void Fox. They get that junker shooting straight yet?" "That's what I'm trying to find out, Tower," she replied as she kept flipping on her systems as she checked them off on the list in her HUD. "But we can't call them junkers. I was thinking abominations." "Ooh, that's good. I'll add that to the pool. I think it's got real potential. You going to cast any money in yet?" Sula snorted at the offer. Normally Tower was very professional, but they were suckers for naming things. Last she heard the best odds were on zombie, but she thought abomination sounded more menacing, so it might quickly climb the betting pool. "No thanks, Tower, but I appreciate the offer." They'd warmed the systems up for her already, but they'd also been optimizing it since that first time she flew it, so now from cold to flying only took about 5 minutes. One when it was warmed up for her like this. She finished her own checklist and looked outside to see Fry give her a thumbs up, which she returned. "Tower, this is Void Fox. I've been given the go-ahead by my crew. I am out the door." The crew moved further away as the fighter lifted up off the deck, and then she was out the door into the void. "We're tracking you, Green Void Fox. Good flying. Try not to shoot anyone friendly today. Tower out." She smirked again as she began to fly down the Retribution and then deeper into the void. Right now they were en route to some sort of bug world she had heard, but no one really knew why. For now they were in an essentially empty system. Star, 2 hot Jupiters and a barren rock, that was it. Not even a refueling station. Normally she'd aim at the star for this sort of test, but with the Reaper and Obsidian Butterfly close by, she decided to fly well away from the 3 ships and aim out of system to really be sure she wouldn't hit anything. Cranking the power to the engines up to 85%, she punched it and gasped a little as she felt herself get shoved back into the seat. It wasn't like that fake pull in the pod. This was the real feel of massive acceleration. The twin Phoenix engines bolted onto this monster really could pump out some serious speed. She kept flying straight back and away from the Retribution for 5 minutes before finally killing her engines and slowly throttling back to bring her speed down to almost nothing. She was drifting forward at only 5% power for now and dumped as much power into her stabilizers as she could. With that done, she lined herself up at one of the brightest stars she could see in the distance. She knew it was virtually impossible, but she liked to think that these rounds might fuck up someone's day in about 1,000,000 years. Here goes nothing, she muttered to herself before pulling the trigger. There was a second of silence, and then her whole fighter shook as she could hear a heavy "Ba-ba-ba!" "Fuck me!" she cursed as the force of the weapon firing actually began to push the fighter backwards. But the stabilizers held, and after 10 seconds, she let go. There were warnings in her HUD about overstressed stabilizers and already being down to 50% ammo, but she knew they hadn't filled her reserves for the test. Slowly, she shook her head and then opened a channel with Tower. "Tower, this is Void Fox. Did you get that?" "That's affirmative, Void Fox. One successful weapons test. Though we think there might be an issue with some of our sensors as it appeared your ship was moving backwards." "No mistake, Tower. This cannon is a beast." She tapped on her intel suite to send the data back to the Retribution, even as she made sure to divert all her power away from the gun. "Did you let Fry know?" That's affirmative, Void Fox. She'd already talking about breaking out the champagne and having a barbecue to celebrate." Sula laughed and shook her head as she began to fly back to the massive ship, celebrating just a successful weapons test. The engineers sure were ready to start partying, it seemed. But as she flew back, she thought about why that might be. This was the first new fighter model the fleet had seen in a decade. Well, sort of new model. It was something they built, by hand, from scratch. And she was training the first new pilots the fleet had gotten in just as long. She was a part of the Fleet of the Damned's first foray into creating a new class of fighter, for a new class of pilots. She smiled at the thought. It really felt good to be a part of building something again instead of just killing, destroying, or looting. Maybe there really was hope for them all to find a home away from the Congos, to live free. Or maybe they'd all die horrible deaths in battle long before ever seeing a life of peace. Sula took a slow, deep breath then and shook her head slowly. No. If she trained her pilots well and Fry came through and really fixed up all these abominations, then there was a chance. A real fucking chance that they'd all live long enough to see this through. Maybe that's why Fry bugged her. The woman was full of hope. She oozed it out of her pores. And Sula, how long had it been since she just sat back and dreamed of a life without battle and conflict? A chance to maybe see her parents again without fear of assassination by the Congos. "Hey, Tower, tell Fry that she better bring a plate for me. And if she can make this thing fly and shoot at the same time, I'll let her name it whatever the hell she wants." It was time for her to stop being annoyed with hope. It was time for her to dig deep and make sure she trained the best damn pilots this fleet had seen. She was going to survive and make sure all her kids lived through this crazy campaign. She was going to be strong. The best pilot she'd ever heard of had just told her that she was strong. Well, Jasmine Nishizawa wouldn't lie about that. Sula was strong, and she was going to use her strength to drive all doubt from her mind. They'd find Jack. The pilots would all survive. And Fry's wonderful creations were going to be a part of all of that. She just knew it. The Void Fox was going to go down in history as being one of the greatest pilots of all time at the helm of the best damn squadron of all time. She grinned at the thought and reached over to pump up the engines to full power as she approached the Retribution. It had been too long since she buzzed the tower. It didn't have the same effect in the void as an atmosphere, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She wasn't going to let anything stop her.